great to see you today. This is the first of our mini podcasts in the startup space. And the reason we've kind of decided to have this conversation today is to really get into the grips of why startups might be a really good opportunity for service leavers. And we have the wonderful Paul David Mather here, who has got extreme background in startups, having left the army and then moving into Deliveroo and then kind of staying within that space in particular. So the first session today is going to be much about your background, Paul, your experience with startups. And then we're going to move on to discuss in the next session a lot more about why startups are a good option for service leavers. Then finally looking at kind of doing your good due diligence to make sure that it is the right move for you. So Paul, I'm going to hand over to you. Could you talk a little bit about your experience, in particular transitioning from the army into startup, and then what you've been doing since and what makes you have all this incredible knowledge of startups?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me, Elly. So I got into startups in 2014. So I had just left the army. I did a 4-year short service commission as an officer in the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. I had been a platoon commander in Afghanistan, and I came back, I promoted to captain, I became a company 2IC, but I think I had a realization that unless I were to go the route of special forces selection or something like that, I wasn't going to have as exciting a job as being a platoon commander in Afghanistan anytime soon again. So I decided to move on, and I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do, because part of the reason I joined the army was because I wasn't really attracted to traditional careers that were being pushed on me when I was at university, like law or management consulting or finance. I wasn't really interested in those. And I really didn't know anything at all about the world of startups, but I came across this website called Escape the City. I don't know if you remember that or we've ever used it. I think it's still around. And I started looking at roles in startups and reading up about what startups actually were. And I looked at a fair few, mainly UK based, mainly London based. And one of them was this food delivery company with this funny little kangaroo logo, which was Deliveroo. And something about their proposition spoke to me. It was a simple proposition on the face of it. Basically, there's all these people in cities who have quite a lot of disposable income, not much time. They want to be able to get decent quality food delivered to them, either at home or in their office. And there's no good way to do that. So we're going to solve that problem. And that spoke to me because it was, on the face of it, a simple solution to a simple problem faced by many people. The reality, of course, is that it's extremely difficult to execute, which was a very interesting challenge to get involved in. But that's what drew me to Deliveroo originally. I think there were lots of other startups I was looking at where I was reading their website for, minutes, even hours in some cases, and I still couldn't quite get my head around what it was they did. And that turned me off, I mean, the army, the value proposition was also quite straightforward, quite easy to get my head around, and that's what had appealed to me. And I think Deliveroo, there was some similarity there. So I applied for a role, the one role that was listed that I thought I could possibly do, which was a commercial expansion role. And I went and had an interview with Will Shue, the CEO, still is the CEO today of the public listed company Deliveroo. And yeah, I mean, from the very first moment of meeting him, it was a bit of a culture shock. Literally, I think I turned up to the interview carrying a suitcase because I think I just moved from Manchester to London. I come down on the train, and because it was a job interview, I just finished being an army officer. I turned up in planters or something like that, like chinos and a pressed shirt. And I think he was wearing sweaty basketball gear and flip-flops. And he took me for a walk to a Starbucks around the corner, and we had an interview. And I think I knew early on in that interview that I probably wasn't going to get that job, because a lot of the stuff he was saying to me was over my head and was not really speaking to me. Essentially, they wanted someone to go and move to Birmingham, I think was the first place, and live out of a suitcase in like a Premier Inn or something, and sell to restaurants and start sort of hiring riders on the street. So it was a very commercially geared role, and I didn't have any selling experience whatsoever. So I walked away from that interview thinking, I don't quite know if this is for me. I didn't get that job, but I was still interested in Deliveroo, and I kept tabs on them. I kept tabs on their updates. I spent the next couple of months helping my younger brother, who was still up in Manchester, where we're from, up a business. He wanted to become a private tutor, having finished university. So I was helping him to set that up. teaching myself how to build websites, helping him to set up his business processes, his business operations. And in the meantime, I was still looking for startup jobs on Escape the City and other platforms. A couple of months later, one came up at Deliveroo again, operations manager. I applied for it, I had an interview, and I had the job within a few days. So that job was a much better fit. It was much easier for me to explain my value and how it would work. Having been an infantry platoon commander, transitioning to managing small at the time fleet of delivery riders was a pretty natural fit, to be honest. And that's how it started. I joined as something like employee 15. We didn't actually keep count, but certainly the second full-time ops manager joining the team at that time. And my very first job was basically coordinating the rider fleet in London, but it was all done completely manually. So I had one static Excel spreadsheet and a mobile phone, and literally I knew the names of all of the delivery riders by heart. And I had to sort of call them up and figure out their schedules around family time, around like Friday prayers if they were Muslim, around like Sunday family time if they were Brazilian, or other things if they were from the UK or other countries. And I had to sort of memorize all of that stuff and figure out how to make sure we could serve the customer demand that was coming in. That was the very first thing that I did. So that was my sort of first foray into the startup world.
I have a couple of questions. First, do you think that first interview you had with, presumably that was the founder, do you think that interview and how you came across that helped you get the interview the second time round for a job that was a better fit? Did you leave that interview with him, like with a good relationship, but just acknowledging that it wasn't the right fit for you in that role?
Yeah, and I think it helped me in two ways. I think it gave me an understanding of how different the culture was from what I was used to. There was no formality about it. He was the founder and CEO, albeit of a very small company, but there was absolutely no formality about it. It was very fast and loose the way that he was talking, which was definitely a culture shock to me. And he was talking about concepts that I had little understanding of. He was asking me about my knowledge of product development and things like that, which I just didn't have a clue about. So it was a good impetus for me to go away and read about that stuff and get my head around it. But the second thing is it also reinforced my view that I would be better off getting into the startup world via a role that was closer to what I had done before, because it would be a smoother transition. So it did definitely make me think, actually, that role sounded interesting, but it's going to be a lot easier for me to get a foot in the door with an operations role, because it's just so much easier to translate my current experience into that would benefit this company. So that's the approach that I took, and I mentor a lot of job hunters nowadays. That's one of the main things that I do now, including service leavers. And that is one of the main things that I do. If someone is making a career transition, particularly if it's quite a bold career transition, I'll try and help them identify what is the closest fit role in the sector or the industry or the market that they want to move into. Because I think finding commonality between the job that you're doing or used to do and the job you want to do next definitely smooths that transition. It's not for everyone. Some people do want to make a complete change in what they're doing, but I think if you want a relatively quick and easy way to get a foot in the door, it makes sense to find a close fit role.
Yeah, and the big talk of transferable skills, which comes through at the whole of the resettlement process, people kind of, I think there's sometimes it's like, oh yeah, transferable skills, what does that actually mean? But actually it's finding that fit and thinking more strategically to say, okay, let's use what we've got now to build on for role later on further down the line, which I think makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? No, I'm just interested to know kind of the mentoring that you do now, still within the startup space. Could you talk a little bit about that? And have you seen any differences from your time with Deliveroo back in 2014 versus startups now, and some of the main considerations within that?
Yeah, totally. So alongside the career mentoring that I do, I also do more business or startup mentoring for founders and senior operators in the startup space. I think one of the biggest things that's changed since I got into the game 10 years ago now, doesn't feel like that long, but it's quite a long time now, is when I joined Deliveroo, and for the few years following that, probably until about 3 years ago-ish, there was a lot more money floating around, a lot more capital floating around that was going into startups and scale ups. So a lot of startup companies were focused on growing very fast and scaling very fast, adding headcount and expanding quickly into other markets within the UK if they're a UK based company, and then quickly expanding into foreign markets overseas to try and grow their footprint and try and grow revenue. And I think that's changed quite a lot now. A lot more startups now are trying to be profitable much sooner, and they're a lot leaner in the way they operate. They're more reticent to add headcount. They're more cautious about expanding into new markets or new verticals, and rightly so, I think, because it's harder to raise funds. So if you make mistakes and spend cash too quickly and you can't replace it by generating enough revenue, then you're going to go out of business. So whereas previously, when I started out freelancing, when I left Deliveroo in 2019, there were good 2 years where I was helping companies to grow still quite quickly if they wanted to do that, and helping them to hire. I did quite a lot of hiring of ops managers, heads of ops, COOs, those kinds of roles. Nowadays, I'm more focused on helping them to find ways to cut cost and to be more lean in the way they operate, to try and leverage more out of their existing team rather than growing it or taking a bolder approach to the way they manage people. So in the past, it would be a bit more ruthless. We'll get someone in the door, and if it doesn't work out, it doesn't matter, because they'll churn out of the business. They'll find a role somewhere else that's a better fit. We'll get someone else in the door, replace them. But hiring people, firing people, replacing people, it's expensive. So companies now have to be a lot more careful, which I think is good, because it means they have to think more carefully from the very beginning of the process. What skills, experiences, attributes are we actually trying to bring into the company? What's the best role to create to achieve that effect? And then who is the best fit person for that role? And only then do they start talking to candidates. I mean, that's like the gold standard anyway. Whereas in the past, it was a lot more fast and loose. Like, let's just go for a coffee. Like, if the face fits, right, they're in the door, bang. Maybe it works out, maybe it doesn't. And then you do the same thing again in 3, 6, 9 months. But I think there's a lot less of that happening now. So people are taking a more conscientious approach to hiring on the whole.
So Paul, I have a question. Like, when you look back at when you joined Deliveroo, did you have the concept of what their runway was, or what round of funding they'd got to? Because people join a startup for the excitement, not really consciously aware sometimes that there's a finite length of time that business can survive unless its revenue grows, certainly in the old world. Did you think about that? I mean, compared to obviously the advice you'll be giving now, what was your thought process around any due diligence?
I didn't honestly, no. I knew that Deliveroo was, I can't remember the exact timing, they'd either just closed or were just about to close a Series A. So I knew that was a good sign, and that they were about to have a few million in the bank. But beyond that, I didn't know. I didn't know whether that would last 3 weeks or 3 months or 3 years. I had no idea.
Yeah.
I guess, believed what I was told, which was that Deliveroo was going places. They were going to invest this money. They were going to make it into a big thing. And even back then, 10 years ago, Bill Shue, the founder, CEO, and the other execs that he'd hired in at that early stage were talking very boldly about what Deliveroo was going to achieve. They were talking about Deliveroo becoming a unicorn, and that was many years before they ever did. So all credit to them. They had a vision, and they stuck with it, and they were able to achieve it. But of course, you're quite right. People say 90% of startups never manage to achieve that. So yeah, I would definitely advise people nowadays to think about, where is this company actually going? Are they actually solving a real problem? Do they have the right leadership in place? Are they realistically going to be able to raise enough cash to achieve what they're setting out to achieve? Because it's harder to do that than it was before. And I think part of what gave me faith in Deliveroo, as I mentioned, that was one of my reasons for joining, was the simple value proposition. It seemed relevant to a lot of people, like millions and millions of potential customers, very relevant to them. And it wasn't reinventing the wheel in a way. It was improving something that already existed, rather than inventing some new piece of technology or some entirely new product out of nothing. So it seemed much more believable. I mean, I never would have predicted the amount and the variety of challenges that we faced along the way to actually achieve that. So perhaps that was naive of me, bought into it even from that early stage. But yeah, I would absolutely advise people to be cautious about going into a startup and to think carefully about the longevity of that company. And it depends also on your risk profile, right? Like if I was a mid-20s junior captain, like no mortgage, no kids, no dependencies. So I could afford to take a lot of risk. And I took a big pay cut, considering all of the benefits that I had in the army before. All in all, I took a big pay cut to join Deliveroo and move to a more expensive city. Quickly, I got back up to what I was being paid before, and then more. But and I got equity in Deliveroo as well. But to begin with, it was quite a big financial risk. If I had been leaving as a major with a mortgage and 2 kids, like it probably would have been out of the question for me to make that decision, or at least a lot harder to justify in terms of the risk profile. So I definitely would advise people to be cautious and think about their particular financial circumstance.
That's really, really valuable advice, and I think we'll touch on it in kind of the next kind of session or so. I would just like to go back, just for the benefit of listeners, to just expand on what Series A means and also what is meant by unicorn in the startup space, because it is a different language, isn't it? It's a new language within itself.
Yeah, so Series A is like the first sizable investment round that is typically led by VCs, by venture capital firms. And I guess that's the stage at which things become a lot more serious because the stakes are a lot higher. You're talking about millions going into the company, whereas before it's probably hundreds of thousands or maybe even less than that if it's, a seed round or even a smaller sort of family and friends round where it's like your mates and your parents chipping in, or maybe smaller scale investors if it's a proper seed round, like angel investors, predominantly individuals effectively who are wealthy and will buy a certain amount of your equity and give you some advice in return. But Series A is the point at which you're getting serious professional investment firms involved, and they're taking a seat at the table, like a board seat. So they start to have a level of control over the decisions that you make as founders. So you're giving away a certain amount of control in return for that cash. And also it tends to put you on a kind of one-way conveyor belt where you're trying to achieve a specific goal. They're looking for a multiple X return on their investment. So you need to be prepared if you're taking on that funding to grow to a certain size in order for those VCs to get their money back, which perhaps means taking a different path to growth and perhaps even means changing the nature of your product fundamentally compared to what your original vision was. So it's certainly not for everyone. I think there's this idea people have in their head that to be a successful startup, you need to raise VC funding. I think that's one way to do it, but it also has its downsides. You get a lot of cash in the bank, but you pay for that, not only directly in terms of equity, but also you give up control and you commit yourself to going down a certain path of, like hyper growth, as people would say. And unicorn status is reaching a valuation of £1 billion or dollars, depends on the market that you're in. But traditionally it would have been $1 billion, even if you're looking at a UK-based company, which again is a huge commitment. To take a company from the size of Deliveroo when I joined it to something that's worth $1 billion, that's a serious undertaking, and only a tiny proportion of startups are ever going to achieve that. I don't know what the actual figure is, but it must be like something in the order of 1 in 100, if that.
Absolutely. That's been really good. Karen, have you got any final questions for this part of the series?
I think we're all good there.
No, great. Okay, thank you for that bit. I think the main bit that I've kind of taken away from this is kind of really, really good to hear your transition from the army into a very, very new space. And I really think the main bit is you saw your skills and saw your in to Deliveroo, and then starting to build on the appetite, the risk appetite, and the reasons for moving into that space. We're going to talk a little bit more a bit later about due diligence, so I won't kind of go into too much just now, but that's been a really good insight there, Paul, so thank you very much.